The iron was still hot when they pressed it to my skin. I didn't scream. I promised myself I wouldn't. My teeth cracked against each other from the pressure of keeping that promise. My wrists were bound behind me with silver-threaded rope, the kind that doesn't just restrain a wolf. It burns her. Slowly. Deeply. Like it wants to remind her that she is nothing. That she has always been nothing. "Rogue," the elder announced, his voice carrying across the clearing like it was proud of itself. The pack stood in a circle around me. 50, maybe 60 wolves. Some I had grown up beside. Some I had eaten with. Some I had mourned with when winter took our weakest members and grief moved through the pack like a second cold. None of them stepped forward. Not one. By the authority of the Ashbourne Pack Council, the elder continued, and in accordance with the old laws, the female known as Isla Voss is hereby stripped of rank, stripped of name, and cast out as a rogue wolf. Bound by no pack. Protected by no alpha. Subject to termination on sight by any ranked wolf who finds her beyond these borders. Termination. Such a clean word for such a dirty thing. He meant killed. He meant hunted. He meant, we are letting the world do what we don't want to dirty our hands with. The brand touched my shoulder blade and the world went white. My knees hit the dirt. The silver rope tore at my wrists. I felt the flesh at my back singing, a horrible high-pitched sensation that had no business being silent, and yet I kept my jaw locked, kept my face turned toward the ground, kept everything inside a box I didn't know if I'd ever be able to open again. Don't give them the scream. Don't give them anything. When it was over, they threw a torn gray cloak over me. The symbol of a rogue. The color of someone the world has already decided to forget. They dragged me to the border in the dark. No moon. No stars. Just cold earth and colder silence. The elder said one final thing before they cut the silver rope and shoved me stumbling into the treeline. If you are found in these lands again, we will not wait for a trial. I stood at the edge of that forest for a long moment. The burn on my shoulder was still singing. My wolf, the part of me that had always been fire, always been fury, was strangely quiet. Not broken. Quiet. Like she was listening. Like she already knew something I didn't. I pulled the gray cloak tighter and walked into the dark. I had no idea that in 3 days, I would be dragged in chains before the most powerful alpha in the known world. I had no idea he would look at me, just look at me, and then do something no alpha had ever done in recorded history. He would kneel. And everything I thought I knew about who I was would shatter into something entirely new. Chapter 1. 3 days before the kneel, I was starving. Not metaphorically. Not the kind of hungry that a warm meal fixes. I mean the kind of hunger that makes your hands shake. The kind that strips away pride and dignity and everything civilized until all that's left is the animal part of you. The part that scans every shadow for something it can eat. I had been running for 72 hours. The Ashbourne border wolves had sent trackers after me. I knew it before I smelled them. The back of my neck had been prickling since the first night, that old instinct that says you are being followed in a language older than words. I'd run west. Then north. Then doubled back east when I caught the scent of a river and realized I could use the water to break my trail. It worked. For a while. But now I was deep in territory I didn't recognize. The trees were older here. Massive oaks with bark like armor, their roots erupting from the soil like fists. The air smelled different. Denser. Like pine resin and something beneath it, something metallic that I couldn't identify. Power. My wolf stirred and whispered, "Power lives here." I ignored her. I needed food. I needed shelter. I needed to figure out where I was before. A twig snapped. I froze. The forest went completely still. Not the natural still of a forest at rest. The charged still of a forest holding its breath because something dangerous is about to happen. 3 wolves stepped out of the treeline ahead of me. Enormous. Even in human form, they radiated dominance, that invisible pressure that makes lesser wolves want to drop their eyes and bare their throats. They wore dark tactical gear with a crest on the chest I didn't immediately recognize. But the energy coming off them. My stomach dropped. Royal Guard. These weren't Ashbourne wolves. These were something else entirely. Something much, much worse for a girl wearing a grey rogue's cloak. Stop, the one in the center said. His voice was flat. Practiced. The kind of voice that had given this command many times and always been obeyed. I stopped. Not because I was obedient. Because I was calculating. 3 Royal Guard wolves against 1 half-starved rogue with a fresh brand burn on her shoulder and silver damage still healing on her wrists. Those weren't good odds. Grey cloak, the one on the left said, his nose lifting. Scenting me. Rogue, the center one confirmed. On sovereign territory, the right one added, and there was something almost satisfied in his voice. Sovereign territory. My brain caught up a second too late. I had run straight into the most controlled, most dangerous landmass in the entire northern wolf world. The territory that answered to only one alpha. The territory that no rogue had ever wandered into and walked out of cleanly. The sovereign lands. Home of King Caden Vale, the alpha of all alphas. The wolf who had united 12 packs under one throne and held them there through a combination of power, strategy, and a reputation so brutal that his name was used to end arguments. And I had stumbled into his backyard while half dead and wearing the mark of a criminal. Don't run, the center guard said, watching my eyes. I ran. Of course I ran. It lasted approximately 40 seconds before all 3 of them shifted and I realized exactly how outclassed I was. I shifted too, or tried to. My wolf came forward but I could feel the silver damage in my wrists slowing the change, making it ragged and painful in a way a normal shift never was. They brought me down in the moss. Gentle enough to restrain. Rough enough to make the brand burn flare white hot. I bit down on a sound. Easy, the center guard said, and he almost sounded like he meant it. We're not going to hurt you. You're going to take me to someone who will, I said into the dirt. A pause. We're going to take you to the king, he confirmed. I closed my eyes. Of course you are. They bound my wrists. Not with silver this time, I noticed. Regular rope. It was a strange mercy from people who owed me none. I filed that away. Strange things are always worth filing away. They marched me through the forest as the sun began to bleed orange through the trees. I walked with my back straight and my chin up, the grey cloak dragging through the moss, the brand singing quietly against my shoulder blade. I thought about running again. I thought about it very seriously. And then I thought about what waited at the end of this march, and I decided that whatever it was, I wanted to see it. My wolf stirred again. And for the first time since the branding, she didn't feel quiet. She felt certain. Chapter 2. Nothing prepares you for the sovereign court. I had heard stories. Every wolf in every pack had heard stories. The great stone fortress built into the base of the Vale Mountains, wide enough to house 500 wolves, old enough that its foundation stones had been laid by the first Alpha King 3 centuries ago. But stories don't prepare you for the weight of it. It came into view as we crested a ridge in the grey pre-dawn light, and my footsteps slowed involuntarily. The guard didn't rush me. Maybe they were used to this reaction. Maybe everyone who saw it for the first time had to stop and simply receive it. The court was built from dark stone, almost black in this light, with towers that rose against the mountain like natural formations, like the rock itself had decided to become architecture. Torches burned along the outer wall even in the approaching dawn. The gates were open. They were always open, I would later learn. King Caden Vale had never closed his gates. It was either supreme confidence or supreme arrogance. Possibly both. The inner courtyard was already moving with wolves despite the early hour. Soldiers drilling in formation. Advisors crossing between buildings with scrolls and urgency written across their faces. Kitchen workers hauling supplies. The whole complex breathing like a living thing. Everyone noticed me. No one stared. That restraint was somehow more intimidating than staring would have been. It meant they were trained. It meant they had seen things. It meant prisoners in grey cloaks were not unusual here. The center guard, whose name I still didn't know and didn't plan to ask, spoke briefly to a woman near the inner gate. She was tall, sharp-featured, wearing the same dark crest but with additional silver detailing that marked rank. She looked at me. Her expression told me nothing. The king is in early session, she said. We found her on the eastern ridge. deep inside the border. Deliberately. The guard glanced at me. She's half-starved and ran the moment she saw us. Reluctantly admitting I wasn't a threat. Interesting. Bring her in, the woman said. He'll want to deal with this himself. He'll want to deal with this himself. The words should have terrified me. They did terrify part of me, the rational part, the survival-focused part that understood exactly what dealt with meant for a rogue on sovereign land. But my wolf lifted her head. And breathed. Like something in this place smelled like something she'd been looking for. I shook it off. Silver damage and exhaustion were clearly affecting my mind. I needed food and rest, not hallucinations. They brought me through a corridor of dark stone and warm torchlight. The floor was worn smooth by centuries of boots. The walls held no decoration except for carved symbols I half recognized. Old pack language, old power markers, old names written in the ancient script. And then the corridor opened. Into a great hall. High ceilings. Long table. Morning light now beginning to cut through narrow windows high above. A fire at the far end. And gathered around one end of the table, 6 wolves in the middle of what was clearly an early strategic session, papers spread, voices low. The guard's hand closed briefly on my arm. Wait here. I waited. I looked at the 6 wolves. 5 of them I catalogued and dismissed, ranked, powerful but secondary. The kind of powerful that exists in the orbit of something bigger. The 6th had his back to me. He was seated at the head of the table, but even seated, there was something about the way space arranged itself around him. Like gravity had a preference. Like the room acknowledged him in some way rooms aren't supposed to be capable of. Dark hair. Broad shoulders under a simple black shirt. No ceremony, no adornment, just someone who had never needed decoration to announce what he was. One hand rested on the table, the other held something. A document, maybe. He hadn't looked up. He was speaking in a low voice to the wolf beside him. I couldn't hear the words from where I stood. But then, he stopped. Mid-sentence. He just stopped. His head lifted slightly. Not toward me. Toward the air. Like he'd caught something. Scenting. The hand on the table went very still. And slowly, with the kind of deliberate control that spoke of enormous effort, King Caden Vale turned his head. He looked at me from across the great hall. I looked back. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. And then every wolf at that table felt the shift in his energy, that invisible thing that dominant wolves broadcast when something changes inside them, and 5 sets of eyes swung toward me, trying to understand what they were feeling. The king stood. He stood slowly, with his eyes still fixed on me, and the room went so quiet I could hear the fire. I raised my chin. I refused to look away. I was a half-starved rogue in a torn grey cloak with a brand burn on my back and silver damage on my wrists, standing in the hall of the most powerful wolf alive. And I would not look away. He crossed the hall. He walked toward me with unhurried, measured steps, and I watched him come and tried to catalogue him the way I'd catalogued the others. Analytically, safely, from behind the glass of survival instinct. It wasn't working. He was tall. Not in a way that statistics captured. In a way that registered in the body first and the mind second. His eyes were dark, not brown, not black, something between that had no clean name. His face was the kind of face that looked like it had been made for difficult decisions. Strong jaw. A scar through the left brow that was old enough to be part of the map of him. He stopped 6 feet from me. His chest rose and fell. He was scenting me. Openly. Without apology or subtlety. And his expression. I couldn't read it. In all my years of reading dominant wolves, and survival had made me very good at reading dominant wolves, I had never seen an expression quite like that one. It was not hunger. Not threat assessment. Not the cold calculation of someone deciding what to do with a problem. It looked almost like recognition. "What's your name?" he said. His voice was low. The kind of low that comes from a chest built for it. But there was something underneath the control. Something that wasn't quite controlled. "Isla," I said. "Isla Voss." Something moved across his face so quickly I almost missed it. "Who branded you?" he said. I blinked. I hadn't told him about the brand. It was beneath the cloak hidden. But he'd scented it. Of course he had. He could probably scent everything. The silver damage, the starvation, the days of running. All of it written in the air around me like a testimony. The Ashbourne Council, I said. On what grounds? Treason, I said. Or what they called treason. The words sat between us. He studied my face. Take off the cloak, he said. The guard behind me shifted uncomfortably. This was not a typical command. Rogues were not typically asked to. Your Majesty, the sharp-featured woman began. Take off the cloak, he said again. He wasn't looking at anyone but me. I reached up. I unclasped the grey cloak. I let it drop. Beneath it I was wearing the same clothes I'd been thrown out in. Practical but rough, torn at the knee from the chase, dirt-stained at the hem. The silver rope burns on my wrists were visible. Healing, but visible. And at my left shoulder, peeking above the neckline of my shirt, the edge of the brand. The rogue's mark. 3 angular lines that meant outcast. That meant less than. King Caden Vale looked at the brand. And something happened to his face. Something cold and certain and extremely dangerous. He looked back at my eyes. How long ago? He said. Quietly. 3 days. A muscle in his jaw moved. He looked at the guard who had brought me in. Feed her, he said. Give her a room with a fire and a healer for the burns. No one touches her until I've spoken with the council. She's a rogue, Your Majesty, the sharp-featured woman said carefully. Protocol requires. I know what protocol requires, he said. He looked at me one more time. And in his eyes, just briefly, just for a flash, I saw something that made my wolf go completely, utterly still. Like she had been waiting her whole life for this exact moment. You're not going anywhere, he said to me. And then quieter, and neither am I. He turned and walked back to his table. And I stood there in the center of the great hall, trying to understand what had just happened. And why, for the first time in 3 days, the brand on my shoulder had stopped hurting. Chapter 3. The healer's name was Mira. She was small, round-faced, with quick eyes and hands that moved like they'd had decades of practice being gentle in a world that wasn't. She didn't ask about the brand. She didn't ask about the silver burns. She cleaned them, treated them, dressed them, and handed me a bowl of broth so thick it was practically solid, and she did all of it without asking a single question that I wasn't ready to answer. I liked her immediately. The room they'd given me was in the east wing of the court, small but real, with stone walls that held the warmth of the fire and a bed that had actual blankets on it. After 3 days of forest floor and cold ground, the blankets felt obscene. Felt like something I didn't deserve. I ate the broth. I let Mira work. And then, when she was wrapping the last of the silver burns on my right wrist, she paused. Just for a moment. Her fingers stilled. What? I said. Nothing, she said. You stopped, I said. What did you find? She resumed wrapping. Didn't answer. Mira. She tied off the bandage. Then she looked up at me, and there was something careful and deliberate in her expression. Like she was deciding something. You've been running on silver damage, she said. Which means your healing is suppressed. Which means, she paused again. Some of what I'm seeing in your system is things your body would normally mask. Things like what? She set my hand down gently. Have you always had the secondary mark? She said. I stared at her. The what? Mira stood. She crossed to a small cabinet and came back with a mirror. Not large but large enough. She positioned it carefully so I could see the back of my own left shoulder. The brand was there. 3 angular lines. Dark and raw and ugly. But she angled the mirror slightly, and in the better light of the fire. Beneath the brand. Beneath it, layered below it in a pattern so subtle I had never seen it in 22 years of looking at my own skin, there were markings. Not scars. Not a brand. Something organic. Something that had always been there, the way a vein is always there beneath the skin. Gold-touched. Faint as moonlight. Curling in a pattern I had seen before. Not on skin, but in old books. in the history chapters that pack elders always skimmed past, in the ancient script on the walls of this very fortress. My blood went cold. "That's not possible," I whispered. "I thought you might say that," Mira said softly. That's the sovereign line," I said. "That marking is the bloodline marker of it's ancient. It's from the original." "Yes," Mira said. "That can't be on me. I'm a nobody. I grew up in Ashbourne's outer territories. My parents were." "What were your parents?" Mira asked. I opened my mouth and closed it, because the truth was, I didn't know. I had never known. I had been told my parents died when I was an infant. A border conflict. Common enough tragedy in pack life. I had been raised by the pack collectively, which was also common enough, and which, I suddenly realized, was an explanation that told me nothing about where I actually came from. Who had placed me in Ashbourne? Who had decided that's where I would grow up? And who, 3 weeks ago, had suddenly decided I was a traitor? Not for anything I had done, but for something the elder had called an incompatible nature. An incompatible nature. At the time, I had thought it was madness. Political maneuvering. Jealousy, maybe, from ranking wolves who didn't like how quickly I'd risen in pack work despite having no formal rank or bloodline. Now I was looking at the underside of a brand in a mirror in the sovereign court, and incompatible nature was taking on a completely different meaning. "Does the king know?" I asked. Mira was quiet for a beat too long. "Mira, does he know?" "I think," she said carefully, "that the king may have known the moment you walked into his hall." I set the mirror down. I looked at the fire. The flames were the same orange as the torches in the courtyard outside. Moving the same way. Following the same physics. Everything around me was behaving exactly as it should. So why did I feel like the entire ground had shifted 2 feet to the left? "What does it mean?" I asked. "The marking. If it's real, if it's actually the sovereign line, what does it mean for someone like me?" Mira looked at me steadily. "It means," she said, "that you weren't branded as a rogue because you did something wrong." She folded her hands in her lap. "It means you were branded because someone wanted to make sure you never found out what you are." The fire cracked. Outside the window, the sovereign court moved through its morning with its usual controlled efficiency. Guards rotating, advisors conferring, the whole machine of power grinding forward. And in this small warm room with its wool blankets and careful healer, I sat with the information that my entire life had been a cage someone built specifically for me, and tried to decide what I was going to do about it. There was a knock at the door. We both looked at it. "Yes," I said. The door opened. It was one of the king's guard, not the center one from the forest, a different one. Young, straight-backed, extremely careful about where he directed his eyes. "The king," he said, "requests a private meeting." Of course he did. Of course he did. I looked at Mira. She gave me a look that said, "I can't help you with this part." I stood. I smoothed the front of my shirt. I was still wearing the same dirt-stained clothes I'd been thrown out in. My wrists were bandaged. My shoulder was dressed. My hair was something I didn't want to think about. And the king of all alphas wanted a private meeting. I almost laughed. I had walked into his territory half-dead and criminal and catastrophically confused about my own identity, and now things were going to get complicated. "Tell him I'll come," I said. The guard nodded and withdrew. Mira touched my arm gently as I passed. "Isla," she said. I looked at her. She hesitated. Chose her words. "He's not what most people expect him to be." I thought about the way he'd stopped mid-sentence when he scented me. The way he'd crossed the hall. The way he'd looked at the brand with something cold and certain moving behind his eyes. "I know," I said. What I didn't say was, "That's exactly what worries me." Chapter 4. The guard brought me to a room I hadn't seen on the way in. Not the Great Hall. Not a throne room. Not anywhere that announced itself with ceremony or intimidation. It was a study. Books on 3 walls from floor to ceiling. A desk that had clearly been worked at. Papers stacked with the organized chaos of someone who actually used them, not someone who arranged them for appearances. A window that looked out over the mountain face, catching the full morning light now, gold and honest and unfiltered. And King Caden Vale, standing with his back to the door, looking out that window. He heard me enter. He didn't turn around immediately. I stood in the doorway for a moment. The guard had retreated, pulling the door closed behind him, and now it was just the two of us and a room full of books and morning light and something electric that I was doing my best to pretend I couldn't feel. "Sit," he said. "I'd rather stand," I said. "A beat." "All right," he said. He turned. In the great hall, with distance between us and half a dozen wolves watching, I had catalogued him in survival mode, noting threat levels and dominant signals the way you do when your life depends on accurate reading. Now, in a quiet study with nowhere to redirect my attention, I had no choice but to simply see him. He was looking at me the same way. Not with the cold assessment of a king evaluating a problem. With something more focused than that. More careful. Like he was trying to read something written very small, and he didn't want to make a mistake. "How much did Mira tell you?" he said. "Enough," I said. "What does enough mean to you?" "It means I know about the marking," I said. "And I know that you probably knew before she did." He crossed to his desk. He didn't sit. He stood on the other side of it, one hand resting on the surface, the same posture I'd seen in the great hall. That quality of stillness that wasn't passivity. That was restraint. "The marking on your shoulder," he said, "is called the Valeran. In the old language it means the sovereign echo," I said. Because I had read the old language in the books the Ashbourne library kept in its back shelves, the ones no elder had ever told me not to read, probably because they'd never imagined someone like me would bother. Something shifted in his expression. Approval, maybe. Or surprise. "The sovereign echo," he confirmed. "It appears only in direct bloodline descendants of the original Vale line." He paused. "The founding line. My line." The words landed quietly. Too quietly. Like stones dropped into deep water. You don't hear the impact, you just watch the rings spread outward. "That's not possible," I said. Not because I disbelieved Mira. Because I needed to hear him say it wasn't. "And yet," he said, "I grew up in Ashbourne's outer territories. I have no family. No records. No. Records can be removed," he said. "People can be relocated. Children can be hidden." Hidden from what? He looked at me steadily. From the people who wanted to make sure a certain bloodline never produced a claimant to the sovereign seat, he said. The room went very still. "I'm not a claimant," I said. "I'm a rogue. I was just branded." "You were made a rogue," he said. 3 weeks ago. After 22 years of being invisible in a pack that should have had no reason to ever notice you." "How do you know how long?" "Because I've been looking for you for 2 years," he said. I stared at him. He held the eye contact without flinching. "Not you specifically," he continued. "I didn't know your name. I didn't know where they'd hidden you. I knew that the sovereign line records showed a secondary heir, a bloodline that should have ended 3 generations ago but didn't. A thread that the old council tried to sever and apparently failed to sever completely." He paused. "I've had people tracing that thread for 2 years. And then 3 days ago, my border wolves found a half-starved rogue in a grey cloak running through my eastern ridge." "And you thought?" "I knew," he said. Quiet. Certain. "The moment I scented you across the hall. The Valeran carries a signature. A frequency. Like a key cut for a specific lock." I pressed my back teeth together. "And what lock?" I said, keeping my voice level. "Do you believe I'm the key for?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down, Isla." "I told you I'd rather." "Please," he said. The word was so simple. And in the mouth of a man who clearly never needed to ask for anything, it hit different than it should have. I sat. He pulled his chair around the desk, not behind it, not placing the barrier between us, and sat across from me, close enough that I could see the scar through his brow clearly. Old. Silver white against his skin. Made by something that hadn't been careful about leaving a mark. "My father," he said, "had a sister." I waited. Her name was Seren. She was younger than him by 4 years. Brilliant by all accounts, strategist, scholar, more instinctively powerful than any wolf born in a generation. He folded his hands. When my father consolidated the 12 packs and moved to establish the sovereign seat, he had enemies. Old alphas who wanted that power for themselves. They couldn't defeat him militarily. So they went after what he loved. His sister, I said. They told him she was dead, Caden said. He believed it. He grieved it. He carried that grief for the rest of his life. I watched him carry it. But she wasn't dead. She was hidden. Somewhere remote, somewhere pack adjacent but under a false name, with a child she'd already had, a daughter she'd never gotten the chance to name officially. The room was very quiet. And that daughter, I said slowly, grew up, he said. Had her own life. Her own children possibly. I don't know yet how many generations it crossed before it reached you. The Valerian doesn't diminish cleanly. It can skip. It can thin. But it doesn't disappear. I looked at the markings on my wrists, the bandages over the silver burns. Beneath them, the skin that carried things I'd never known about myself. So you're saying, I said carefully, that I might be descended from your father's sister? Yes. Which would make you my cousin's child, at minimum, possibly further removed. He met my eyes. Family. Family. The word moved through me strangely. I had never had family. I had grown up in a pack that tolerated me, sometimes kindly, mostly indifferently, occasionally with a pointed hostility I'd never been able to explain. I had built my sense of self out of competence and silence and the refusal to need anyone. And now a king was sitting 3 feet away from me telling me I had a bloodline, a lineage, a name that went further back than I knew. Why did the Ashbourne Council brand me? I asked. If they knew about the marking, if they wanted to hide me, why didn't they just kill you? He said directly. Yes. Because killing someone with the Valerian is complicated, he said. The old laws that govern sovereign bloodlines are older than most pack law. There are consequences, old agreements, things that activate if a Valerian line is deliberately severed. They were afraid, I said. They were afraid, he confirmed. Branding you as a rogue was cleaner, safer. Push you out into the world with the rogue mark and let the world handle you. Let hunger or exposure or a border wolf with no questions do what they were too cautious to do themselves. But instead, I said, I ran straight into your territory. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The shadow of one. Instead, he agreed, you ran straight into my territory. We looked at each other. And the question I'd been circling since Myra's mirror, the question that had been building since the Great Hall, since the moment he'd crossed the room toward me with that expression I couldn't name, finally made it to the surface. In the hall, I said. When you first looked at me. Before you knew about the marking, before you confirmed anything, you looked at me like. I stopped. Like what? He said. Like you already knew me. Like something in you had been waiting for something in me and finally found it. Like the air between us had a history. You looked at me like I was significant, I said instead. A safer version. He held my gaze. The Valerian signature, he said, and what I felt when I scented you are not the same thing. My pulse did something complicated. What does that mean? I said. It means, he said, that some of what I felt was recognition. Bloodline recognition. The sovereign line responding to itself. He paused. And some of what I felt was something else entirely. The fire in the small grate beside his desk crackled. Something else, I said carefully. Isla. He said my name like it fit in his mouth in a way it hadn't fit in anyone else's. I know this is a great deal of information for one morning. I know you have no reason to trust me. I know you came here against your will and you're sitting in my study with silver burns on your wrists and a brand on your shoulder and every reason in the world to be furious and frightened. I'm not frightened, I said. I know, he said. And he sounded like he meant it. That's one of the first things I noticed. A beat. Stay, he said. Not as a prisoner. Not as a rogue. As a guest of the sovereign court until we can untangle what your bloodline means legally and what the Ashbourne Council's actions mean politically. And if I refuse? Then I'll give you supplies and a horse and let you go wherever you choose, he said. And I'll spend every day you're gone worrying about what's hunting you. I stared at him. He met the stare. The man didn't blink. He just sat there in his study surrounded by his books and his morning light and his impossible honesty, and waited. One condition, I said. Name it. I'm not a guest, I said. Guests are comfortable and comfortable people stop paying attention. I want access. To your library. To whatever records you have about the sovereign line. To the information I need to understand what's been done to me and why. He studied me for a moment. Done, he said. And I'm not wearing the grey cloak. Something moved in his eyes. No, he said quietly. You're not. Chapter 5. Word traveled fast in the sovereign court. By midday, everyone knew there was a rogue in the East Wing. By afternoon, they knew the king had given her a room, a healer, and a standing invitation to the library. By evening, the speculation had developed its own ecosystem, layers of rumor and theory that I could practically smell building in the corridors like weather. I heard pieces of it as I moved through the court that first day. Because I did move. I wasn't going to sit in my room and wait for the world to decide what I was. I had never done that and I wasn't starting now. I walked with my head up and my pace even and the brand covered by a shirt with a higher collar that one of the court attendants had brought without being asked. A small mercy that I suspected came from Caden's direction without any ceremony. The library was in the north wing. 3 floors of books accessed by a spiral iron staircase that sang quietly with each step. The librarian, an elderly wolf named Oshan with spectacles and the calm of someone who had outlived several dramatic chapters of history, showed me the section I needed without commentary and left me to it. I spent 4 hours in the old records. What I found was complicated. The Vale bloodline records were meticulous going back 11 generations. Names, birth dates, union records, death records. The kind of documentation that only happens when someone understands that power lives in provenance. Seren Vale appeared in the records clearly up until 3 generations back. Daughter of the 2nd sovereign. Sister of the 3rd, Caden's grandfather, which put Caden himself as the 5th sovereign king. And then Seren's record simply ended. No death date. No cause. Just a line that stopped. In standard records, a line that stops with no death marker means one of 2 things, an administrative error or a deliberate erasure. I had been living inside a deliberate erasure my whole life. I recognized the shape of it now. Beneath Seren's entry, in the margin, in ink that was different, older, the kind that came from a different period than the surrounding text, were 3 words in the old script. I translated them slowly. The echo continues. My hand was very still on the page. Someone had known. Someone had left this marker, not in the main record, where it could be found and removed, but in the margin. Hidden in plain sight the way the Valerian itself was hidden. A message left by someone who understood that truth, if you buried it deeply enough, sometimes survives. You translate the old script. I didn't startle. I had heard him coming. Not his footsteps, but the way the air pressure in the corridor changed when someone significant entered a space. Caden Vale stood at the end of the row, hands in his pockets, watching me with those dark eyes that I was beginning to understand held more than they showed. My pack's library had old texts, I said. I had time and no one bothered me. Most wolves don't bother with the old language anymore, he said. Most wolves know what they are, I said. When you don't, you look for information wherever it exists. He moved down the row and stopped beside me, close enough to see the page, far enough to be deliberate about the distance. He looked at the margin notation. I've never seen that, he said quietly. It's not in the catalogued records, I said. Someone wrote it after. Who? Someone who wanted it to be found by the right person eventually, I said. He leaned slightly closer to read the old script, and the proximity did something to the air between us that I noted and set aside. Set aside, Isla. Focus. The echo continues, he read. That's right. He straightened. He looked at me instead of the page. How do you feel? He said. About the records. About all of it. This morning was a lot, I said. Yes, I know. I closed the record book carefully. I feel like someone built a room around me 22 years ago and only just let me find the door. He was quiet, listening. I feel like I'm angry, I continued, but not at you. And I don't know exactly who to be angry at yet, which makes it, I searched for the word, pressurized. The Ashbourne Council, he said. That's part of it. The people who placed you there to begin with, he added. The ones who hid your father's sister, I said. Which, depending on who they were, might be dead or might not be. Not, he said. At least one of them isn't. I turned to look at him. You know who? I said. I have a strong suspicion, he said. And I'm waiting for confirmation before I tell you, because I don't want to give you a name that turns out to be wrong. Caden. His name came out before I'd decided to use it. Without the title. Just his name. Something in his expression changed. When I know for certain, he said, you'll know. I promise you that. I held his gaze. Dominant wolves didn't make promises lightly. They made them the way they made everything, with the full understanding that their word was a structural thing, and structures that fail bring everything built on them down. All right, I said. We stood in the library stacks for a moment in a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable. Your people are watching me, I said. Yes. Not in a hostile way, I clarified. More like curious, he said. Yes. They can feel something. They don't know what. The Valerian signature. Partly, he said. And partly, he stopped. Partly what? He looked away briefly. Something that might, on another man, have been the beginning of awkwardness. There are things I need to confirm before I say them, he said. An echo of his earlier restraint. I'm trying to be careful. You're choosing your words very deliberately, I said. For someone with your reputation. What's my reputation? Decisive. Direct. Cuts through complexity. That's for pack politics and military strategy, he said. This is, he glanced at me, different. Different how? The question sat in the air between us. And before he could answer, before whatever careful, deliberate thing he was building could be said, the library door opened. The sharp-featured woman from this morning, the one who'd tried to invoke protocol in the Great Hall, appeared at the end of the stacks. Your Majesty, she said, the Ashbourne Alpha is here. Everything in Caden went still. That controlled, total stillness I'd seen twice now. The first time when he scented me across the hall, the second time when I'd mentioned the brand. Alpha Greer, he said. He arrived 20 minutes ago. Says it's urgent. I'm sure he does, Caden said. The temperature in his voice had dropped several degrees. He looked at me. Go back to your room, he said. Quiet. Firm. Absolutely not, I said. Isla. If the alpha of the pack that branded me is in this building, I said, I have more right to be in that conversation than anyone. You have no formal standing yet too. Then give me standing, I said. We looked at each other. The sharp-featured woman was very carefully looking at the bookshelves. What's your name? I asked her. She blinked. Captain Nessa, my lady. My lady. Interesting choice. Captain Nessa, I said, is there a protocol for the king to bring an acknowledged guest to a meeting with a visiting alpha? A very brief pause. Yes, she said. There you go, I said to Caden. He stared at me for one long moment. And then, quietly, in a voice that carried absolutely no inflection, he said, she'll need different clothes. Chapter 6. They gave me 40 minutes. New clothes, dark-fitted, nothing ceremonial but nothing ragged either. Someone had anticipated this possibility, which meant Caden had anticipated it, which meant he'd had a plan for this moment before I'd argued my way into it. I wasn't sure if that annoyed me or impressed me. Both, probably. Nessa walked beside me as we moved through the court toward the formal receiving room. I'd changed my assessment of her in the library. She was sharper than her formality suggested, with the kind of intelligence that worked best when it appeared to be following protocol. Greer, I said. Tell me about him. Alpha of the Ashbourne Pack for 11 years, she said. Consolidationist. He's been pushing for Ashbourne to be recognized as a primary pack, one of the king's inner circle, for most of his tenure. Has he been successful? The king has not yet extended that recognition. Why not? She glanced at me sideways. Various reasons. And now he's here unannounced, I said. He sent a message 2 days ago, she said. The timing of your arrival appears to be coincidental, I said. Or not, she said. 2 days ago. Which was roughly when the border wolves found me on the eastern ridge. Which meant Greer had sent a message before Caden even knew I existed. What was in that message? My jaw tightened. We reached the receiving room. Caden was already there, standing, not seated, which was a deliberate statement about the nature of this meeting. Formal, but not deferential. He had 2 of his senior wolves flanking him, Nessa joining them as I entered. Alpha Greer was younger than I expected. Mid-30s, well-built, with the practiced ease of a man used to being the most powerful person in most rooms. Sandy hair. A face arranged in the particular expression of someone who is extremely concerned and doesn't want you to notice how calculated that concern is. He was looking at Caden when I entered. Then he looked at me. And something behind his arranged concern flickered. Fear. Small, controlled, quickly locked away. But I had been reading wolves my whole life and I caught it before it disappeared. He was afraid of me. Of me. A half-starved rogue he'd had dragged before the pack and branded 3 days ago. Why would Alpha Greer be afraid of me? Unless he knew exactly what I was. Your Majesty, Greer said, turning back to Caden. Thank you for seeing me. Sit, Caden said. They sat at a round table, round, I noticed. No head, no hierarchy implied by position. An old diplomatic choice. I sat where Caden indicated, slightly to his right. Greer's eyes moved to me again. I wasn't aware the meeting would be expanded, he said carefully. The Lady Isla is a guest of the court, Caden said. I don't limit her presence. The Lady Isla, Greer said, and his voice was very controlled, is a branded rogue from my pack. Your Majesty, with respect, I must ask. You must ask very carefully, Caden said. The temperature in the room changed. Greer heard it. He was smart enough to hear it. I'm here, Greer said, shifting tracks smoothly, because I received word that a rogue from Ashbourne had been found on sovereign land. I came immediately to explain the circumstances of her departure and to offer. What circumstances? Caden said. She was found in violation of pack law. Treason, specifically. What specific act of treason? Caden asked. A pause. The council determined that her continued presence in the pack posed. What specific act, Caden said again, of treason did she commit? The room was very quiet. I watched Greer recalibrate. Watched him understand that the answers he'd prepared for a king who didn't know what I was were not going to work for a king who did. He stopped. Take your time, Caden said pleasantly. She was found to be of incompatible nature with the pack structure, Greer said finally. Incompatible nature, Caden repeated. That's not a provision of pack law. It's a provision of the Ashbourne Council Code. Which, Caden said, does not supersede sovereign law. And under sovereign law, branding a wolf as a rogue requires specific documented evidence of a specific transgression. Greer's jaw was tight. Furthermore, Caden continued, in the same pleasant tone that was somehow more dangerous than anger, the application of a brand to a wolf carrying sovereign bloodline markings is, I'll let my legal counsel describe the exact terminology, but catastrophic is the word that comes to mind. The silence was absolute. Greer looked at me. I looked back. You knew, I said. My voice was steady. When you had me brought before the council. When you had me branded. You knew what I was. How long? I said. This is not the appropriate. How long did you know? Isla. Caden's hand rested briefly on the table near mine. A grounding gesture. I'm here. Stay steady. I pulled a breath. Greer's face had gone carefully expressionless. The mask of a politician who has realized the room is not arranged the way he thought it was. I want to be helpful, Greer said, pivoting again. I want to work with the sovereign court to resolve this situation. Ashbourne has always been loyal. Tell me who instructed you to brand her, Caden said. A beat. The council made its decision collectively. Tell me who gave the original instruction, Caden said. Still pleasant. Still absolutely immovable. The instruction that came from outside Ashbourne. The one that was delivered, I believe, approximately 2 weeks before the council meeting. Greer went very still. How do you, he started. I've had people watching Ashbourne for 2 years, Caden said simply. I didn't know why yet. Now I do. The mask cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. And I saw underneath it something I hadn't expected. Not villainy. Not cold calculation. Desperation. Greer was a desperate man. Desperate men were dangerous, but they were also sometimes reachable. He said she was dangerous, Greer said. Quietly. The fight going out of him in one exhale. Who? I said. He said if she ever found out what she was, if she ever came into contact with the sovereign court, he stopped. He said it would destabilize everything. Who is he? Caden said. Greer looked at Caden. And then he looked at me. His name is Dorian Vale, he said. The room went completely silent. I didn't know the name. But Caden's hand, the one resting near mine on the table, had gone absolutely, completely still. And the air pressure in the room changed in the way it changes when a dominant wolf is controlling something enormous. Your Majesty, Nessa said carefully from behind us. Leave us, Caden said. Your Majesty. All of you. Leave us. They left. The door closed. And in the receiving room of the sovereign court, with the morning light burning through the windows and Greer watching us both with the expression of a man who has just pulled a pin from something he doesn't know how to put back, I turned to Caden. Who is Dorian Vale? I said. He was looking at the table. Not at me. At the table. Caden. He lifted his eyes. And the thing I saw in them was not anger. Not cold calculation. Something rawer than that. The kind of thing that only exists on a face when the truth is bigger than the armor. My uncle, he said. My father's younger brother. The one who, he stopped. The one who what? The one who told my father his sister was dead, he said. 30 years ago. The silence expanded. He lied, I said. He lied, Caden confirmed. He hid her. And when she had a child, maybe more than one, he hid them too. Because as long as the sovereign line appeared to end with me. He was next, I said. If something happened to you. Without another bloodline heir. He was next, Caden said. I sat back. The whole shape of it resolved. 30 years of lies. A woman hidden under a false name in a remote territory. A bloodline suppressed through 3 generations. And when something, or someone more likely, noticed the thread still existed, Dorian Vale had picked up the phone and called a desperate, ambitious alpha in Ashbourne and told him to deal with it. With me. He's here, isn't he? I said slowly. In the court. Caden's expression confirmed it before he spoke. He's been my chief advisor for 6 years, he said. I closed my eyes briefly. 6 years. The man who hid my bloodline, who had my predecessor, Seren, the Echo, whoever she was to me, erased from the record. Sitting at the right hand of the king for 6 years. And Caden hadn't known. He's going to know, you know, I said. As soon as Greer reports back. Greer isn't going anywhere, Caden said. He's staying in the court as my guest until I decide what his role in this was. Then Dorian will find out another way. Yes, he said. So we have, how long before he moves? Caden looked at me. And for the first time since I'd walked into his great hall, I saw something underneath the king of it. Something human and uncertain and furious about having been blind to something in his own house for 6 years. Not long, he said. Then we need to move first, I said. He blinked. We. I met his eyes. You said I'm not going anywhere, I said. And neither are you. I think that means we're in this together, whether or not either of us was planning on it. He looked at me for a long moment. The morning light caught his scar. The fire behind him burned even and constant. Isla, he said. Don't tell me to go to my room, I said. I wasn't going to, he said. A beat. I was going to say, he stopped. Something working behind his eyes. I was going to say that I'm sorry. For what was done to you. For what my family's history cost you. Whatever debt exists there, I know it's mine to reckon with. The words were careful and they were real. I recognized the difference. Start reckoning with it by helping me figure out who I actually am, I said. And then by helping me make sure Dorian Vale doesn't get to just walk away from 30 years of this. He nodded. Done, he said. And for the second time in one day, he said that word with the full weight of what it meant. Chapter 7. Dorian Vale was not what I pictured. I had built him in my mind during the hours after the meeting with Greer. I had given him cold eyes and a cruel mouth and the unmistakable energy of a man who enjoyed what he did. I had made him into something I could read from across a room and respond to accordingly. The reality was more dangerous. He was elegant. That was the first word. Not tall, not imposing, elegant. Silver-haired in the way that looked intentional, with a face that had aged into distinction rather than decay. He moved through the court like someone who had belonged there so long the stones recognized his footsteps. Warm when he spoke to the lower-ranked wolves. Attentive when Caden's advisors addressed him. Generous with his time in a way that made everyone around him feel seen. I watched him for 2 hours from various distances before he knew I was watching. I did it from the corridors. From the dining hall doorway. From the upper gallery that overlooked the courtyard where the morning briefings happened. I watched him and I tried to find the seams. Every performance has seams. Places where the mask sits slightly wrong, where the effort of maintaining it creates a visible tension. You just have to know what you're looking for and be patient enough to wait for it. I found his seam at the end of the second hour. He was speaking with a junior advisor near the east corridor, the corridor that led to the guest wing. My wing. And as they spoke, his eyes moved. Not dramatically. Not suspiciously. Just, once briefly, in the way that eyes move when a thought interrupts a conversation and pulls attention somewhere else. They moved toward the east corridor. And then back. And his expression had done something in that half-second. Just a flicker. Just a tremor in the warm, elegant mask. He knew I was here. Greer hadn't told him. Greer was still being held in a comfortable room on the west side under the polite fiction of extended diplomatic hospitality. But the court talked. I'd established that on day one. And Dorian Vale had been listening to this court talk for 6 years. He knew. And he was afraid. Not the way Greer was afraid, messy and desperate and showing at the edges. Dorian's fear was architectural. Built into the foundation of his composure rather than sitting on top of it. Which made him much more dangerous. I went to find Caden. He was in the war room, a chamber off the great hall that I hadn't been in yet, with maps on 3 walls and a table built for strategy rather than diplomacy. He was there with Nessa and 2 others I'd seen but not been introduced to, a lean, sharp-eyed wolf named Bram who handled intelligence, and a woman named Petra who I gathered was the court's chief legal mind. They looked up when I entered. Caden's eyes moved over me quickly, checking, assessing, the way they'd been doing since yesterday. Like he was continuously verifying that I was still real. He knows, I said. I've been watching him for 2 hours. He knows I'm here. How can you tell? Bram asked. His tells, I said. He's very controlled, but he checks the east corridor when he thinks no one's watching. He's been doing it at irregular intervals, which means he's not consciously aware he's doing it. It's anxiety response. Bram looked at Caden. She's good, he said, like that was a data point being filed. Tell me what you have, I said to the room. Because there was clearly a conversation already in progress and I was not going to stand at its edges. Nessa glanced at Caden. He nodded once. 3 things, Nessa said, moving to the map table. First, we confirmed overnight that the Ashbourne branding order was issued 12 days ago. Greer received a message, encoded in a trade cipher that his pack uses with several partners. We've traced the cipher origin to a terminal inside this court. Dorian sent it himself, I said. We believe so. Second, Bram's people have been pulling financial records from the past 6 years. There are payments. Irregular, but significant. Going to a chain of intermediaries that traces back, with some difficulty, to a holding in the far northern territories. What's in the north? I asked. 3 things, Petra said quietly. Old mining interests. A rogue coalition that's been gaining numbers for the past decade. And, she paused. A compound that local wolves report being kept very private. The room was quiet. A compound that's been there for, I started. At least 30 years, Bram said. The ground shifted again. Not metaphorically. I felt it in my chest, that sensation of something large becoming real. Seren, I said. We don't know, Caden said. But possibly. Possibly, he confirmed. His voice was completely controlled. His hands on the table were flat and still and giving nothing away. Third thing, Nessa said. This morning's briefing. Dorian requested an urgent session with the king for this afternoon. He says it's regarding rogue activity in the eastern borders. We all absorbed that. He's going to try to frame the narrative, I said. Come to you first with a version of events that positions me as a threat. Make you question what you know before you've confirmed enough to act. Yes, Caden said. And if you cancel the meeting? He knows we're onto him. So you take the meeting, I said. Yes. Then I need to be in it. Isla. Not visibly, I said. I'm not suggesting you seat me at the table. But I need to be somewhere I can hear. Caden looked at me steadily. Why you specifically? Because I'm the only one in this building who has something personal at stake, I said. That's not a liability. That's clarity. I'll hear things in his words that you won't, because I'll be listening for different things. A beat. Bram made a quiet sound that wasn't quite agreement but leaned that direction. There's a listening gallery above the war room, Nessa said carefully. Historically used for. Set it up, Caden said. Then he looked at me. Stay visible until an hour before the meeting, he said. Move through the court normally. If he's watching. Give him something normal to watch, I said. Yes. I know. He held my gaze for a moment. You've done this before, he said. Not a question. Surviving in a pack that didn't want you requires a certain kind of intelligence, I said. Something moved in his expression. Not pity. He was smart enough to know I didn't want pity. Something closer to anger on my behalf. The kind that burns quiet and long. An hour before the meeting, he said. I nodded and left the war room. I walked through the court for the next several hours like I belonged there. Which, it was slowly occurring to me, I might. I ate in the dining hall. I returned to the library and sat with the old records for a visible stretch of time. I nodded to wolves I passed in corridors. I let myself be seen as calm and unrushed and settled. And twice, I felt eyes on me from a distance. The second time I turned, casually without urgency, and met Dorian Vale's gaze from across the courtyard. He smiled. Warm. Gracious. The smile of a man welcoming a guest. I smiled back. It was the most dangerous exchange of my life, and it looked like 2 polite strangers in a corridor. He broke first. Not dramatically. He simply turned to resume his conversation, smooth and unhurried. But he broke first. I walked away and tried to decide if that was reassuring or terrifying. The listening gallery above the war room was accessed by a narrow stair behind a bookcase on the north side of the library. Nessa showed me an hour before Dorian's meeting. The gallery was barely a space, a stone ledge behind a carved grille, overlooking the room below through the gaps in the decorative stonework. Old. Older than the current court, probably. The kind of architecture that knows things happen in rooms that shouldn't happen in the open. I settled into the space and waited. Below, Caden arranged himself at the strategy table with Bram and Petra. 5 minutes later, Dorian Vale entered. From above, watching without being watched, I could see things I hadn't been able to from the courtyard. The way his shoulders carried themselves differently when he thought no powerful eyes were on him. The precision of his movements, nothing wasted, nothing accidental, the economy of motion that belonged to someone who had been performing composure for a very long time. "Nephew," he said warmly. He used the word like a gift. Like something freely offered. "Dorian," Caden said. They sat. "You wanted to discuss rogue activity," Caden said. "Yes." Dorian folded his hands on the table. "I've been monitoring some concerning developments on the eastern border. There have been incursions, not aggressive ones, but notable. I believe there may be an organized rogue element testing our perimeter." "What makes you think it's organized?" Bram said. "The pattern," Dorian said easily. "Random rogue activity is random. What I'm seeing is deliberate. Testing pressure points, mapping patrol gaps. It has the quality of intelligence gathering." "Interesting," Caden said. "I bring it to you now," Dorian continued, "because I understand a rogue was recently brought into the court. Found on the eastern ridge." He paused. "I wonder if she might be connected." There it was. Clean. Simple. The seed of a narrative planted in 3 sentences. The rogue who wandered into your territory might be a scout. Might be a spy. Might be a danger you've invited inside your walls. From the gallery, I watched Caden's face. He was extraordinary. Not a flicker. Not a single tell. He listened to his uncle's careful construction and gave back nothing but attentive neutrality. "What do you know about this rogue?" Caden asked. "Only what's been in the court's common talk," Dorian said. "Ashbourne branded her. She's young. She arrived in poor condition." He paused. "Has she been forthcoming about her origins?" "Reasonably so," Caden said. "And you believe her?" "A bit. I find her credible," Caden said. Dorian nodded slowly, like a man absorbing information and filing it away. "I only raise it," he said, "because the timing concerns me. A rogue branded for treason stumbles into sovereign territory at the exact moment we're detecting organized activity on the eastern perimeter. It may be coincidence, but in my experience..." "Coincidences are worth examining," Caden said. "Exactly." Silence. And then Caden said very quietly, "What do you know about the Valeran, Dorian?" The silence that followed was a completely different kind of silence. From above, I watched Dorian's hands on the table. They didn't move. Not even a finger. Not even a breath. "The Valeran," he said slowly. "The sovereign bloodline marker. Ancient designation. Why do you ask?" "Because it came up in my research recently," Caden said. "I was revisiting some of the old bloodline records. Trying to understand the scope of the documentation we have." "Important work," Dorian said. "Still smooth. Still warm. But underneath. I could see it from the gallery. A stillness that was not calm. I noticed Seren Vale's record ends without a death marker," Caden said. A pause. "A breath too controlled to be natural. Administrative gap," Dorian said. "From that period, the records were..." "The records from every other member of that generation are complete," Caden said. Another pause. "I'm not sure I..." "There's a margin notation," Caden said. "In the old script." The echo continues. "Fascinating, isn't it? Someone felt strongly enough to document that Seren's line persisted, just not strongly enough to do it where it could easily be found." Dorian Vale looked at his nephew. And in his face, from above, from the gallery where I watched without breathing, I saw the warm, elegant mask do something I suspected very few people had ever seen it do. It slipped. Just for a second. Just for the space of one unguarded breath. Beneath it was the face of a man who had carried a secret for 30 years and had just heard the door of the room it was locked in creak open. "Caden," he said. His voice was different. Quieter. The warmth stripped out of it. "Don't," Caden said. One word. The whole room contracted. "Don't tell me a story," Caden said. "Don't give me another version. I have the messages you sent to Ashbourne. I have the financial records. I have the compound in the north. A pause. And I have Isla Voss. Dorian closed his eyes. For a moment, just a moment, he looked like what he was beneath the architecture. Old. Tired. A man who had spent 30 years maintaining something that had finally, inevitably, become too heavy to hold. She can't be allowed to, he started. Don't, Caden said again. Softer this time. But no less absolute. You don't understand what she represents. The instability. The competing claims. The pack structure that has taken 3 generations to build would. Would what? Caden said. Hold less power than you've been pretending to exercise on its behalf for 6 years. Dorian opened his eyes. And looked at his nephew with something that was almost grief. I kept this court safe, he said. You kept yourself safe, Caden said. There is a difference. And you burned a 22-year-old woman's life to do it. Silence. From the gallery, I realized my hands were pressed flat against the stone ledge. My nails were probably leaving marks. What happens now? Dorian said. Now, Caden said, you are going to tell me everything. Starting with where Seren Vale's bloodline actually went and ending with what you know about anyone else who was involved in hiding it. He paused. And then my legal counsel is going to explain to you what sovereign law says about the deliberate suppression of a bloodline heir. Dorian looked at Petra, who looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had been waiting a long time to have this conversation. I'd like to begin, Dorian said quietly, with something that might change the scope of your response. Then begin, Caden said. Seren's daughter, Dorian said. She was not the end of the line. Every person in that room went still. There was another child, Dorian said. Before the daughter. A son. He was placed separately. Farther away. In the Eastern Territories, across the mountain range. A son, Caden said. He would be in his mid-50s now, if he's alive, Dorian said. He may have children. He may have, he stopped. I lost track of the son's line 30 years ago. I focused on the daughters. Why? Caden said. Dorian was quiet. Because the daughter produced the Valerian, he said. The son, I wasn't certain. I made the calculation to focus resources on the confirmed thread. And the confirmed thread, Caden said, is Isla. Yes. Silence. But there may be more, Caden said. Yes, Dorian said. In the gallery above, I pressed my back against the stone and looked at the ceiling and tried to contain the fact that the map of what I was had just expanded again. Larger, older, deeper than it had been 20 seconds ago. There might be others. There might be family I'd never known about. Not historical, not buried in old records, but living. Somewhere. In the Eastern Territories across the mountain range. Alive. And Dorian Vale had spent 30 years trying to make sure none of us ever found each other. I heard Caden's voice from below, steady and controlled and furious underneath. Then we have considerably more work to do than I thought. Chapter 8. They held Dorian in the court that night. Not in a cell. Caden wasn't performing cruelty. But under guard, under restriction, with Petra constructing the legal framework for what came next. Bram's people went to work on the northern compound. Messages were sent to intelligence contacts in the Eastern Territories. The machine of the sovereign court shifted gears. And I sat in the courtyard alone, late in the evening, with the mountain wind moving through the torchlight and everything I'd learned in the past 24 hours stacked up around me like walls I wasn't sure I could scale. Somewhere, there might be a son's line. Family. People who had grown up the same way I had, without knowing. Maybe with the same inexplicable feeling of not quite fitting. The same instinct that something about their history was a room they hadn't been allowed to enter. Maybe not. Maybe they'd been more successfully hidden. Maybe they'd found peace in their anonymity and the last thing they needed was me arriving with 30 years of buried history. I didn't know. I was very tired of not knowing things about myself. The courtyard was mostly quiet. A few guards on rotation at the outer wall. An advisor crossing between buildings with a lamp and the distracted pace of someone who had too much to think about. The mountain behind the court was dark against a sky full of stars, and the air smelled like cold stone and pine resin, and that underneath note of power that I was beginning to identify as simply, Caden. The whole territory carrying the signature of its king. I heard him before I saw him. Not footsteps. That quality of attention that arrived before he did. The way a room acknowledged him, the way even open air seemed to organize itself slightly. He came and sat beside me on the stone bench. He had a mug of something. 2 mugs, actually. He handed me one, without comment. I took it. Hot. Something spiced and dark. We sat in silence for a moment. How long were you in the gallery before I got there? He said. Long enough to watch Dorian arrive. What did you see? He asked. From above. His tells, I said. The way his composure architecture works. He's very good at the mask, but it has structural limitations. He controls his face well, but his hands are where he loses control. I looked at the mug. And when you said my name, at the end, his hands finally moved. A pause. He's afraid of you, Caden said. I know. Not of what you can do, he said. Of what you represent. Everything he spent 30 years suppressing. It's walking around his fortress drinking tea. Spiced tea, I said. Something in the air shifted. And then Caden laughed. It was not what I expected. Low and genuine, surprised out of him, lasting only a second before it became a quieter thing. But real. Completely and entirely real. I looked at him sideways. What? He said. Nothing, I said. I've just been reading you for 2 days and I didn't have that in my calculations. What did you have? Controlled, I said. Decisive. Devastating when you choose to be. Careful about what you show. All accurate, he said. Yes, I said. And then you laughed and all of it was still true but. I looked at the mountain. But you're also just a person, I said. Under all of it. That's all. Silence. That's not an observation most people make, he said. Most people are too close to you to have perspective, I said. I have nothing to gain from seeing you as larger than you are. He turned toward me slightly. The torchlight was warm and uneven, and it caught the scar through his brow and the line of his jaw and the dark eyes that were watching me with that focused, careful quality I was learning was just how he looked. Not threat. Not strategy. Just attention. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. I reserve the right not to answer. When you were in Ashbourne, he said. Before the branding. What was your life like? I was quiet for a moment. Functional, I said finally. I worked in the border patrol offices. Administrative work, mostly. Tracking movement, logging pack entries and exits, coordinating with neighboring territories. I paused. I was good at it. Better than the ranked wolves who technically outranked me. I think that was part of the problem. They noticed you, he said. They noticed I was capable, without having the bloodline to justify it, I said. In a pack that runs on bloodline hierarchy, someone who doesn't fit the expected profile is unsettling. I learned early to be useful but invisible. That's a horrible thing to learn, he said quietly. It's a survival skill, I said. It shouldn't have been necessary. I looked at him. No, I agreed. It shouldn't have been. We sat with that. The wind moved through the torches. The mountain held its enormous dark silence. What was the best day? He said. I blinked. What? In Ashbourne. The best single day you can remember. The question was so unexpected I didn't have my defenses arranged before the answer surfaced. It was winter, I said slowly. About 4 years ago. I was out doing a border check in the northwest quadrant, alone, which I preferred. There had been an ice storm the night before. I stopped, looking at the stone under my feet. Everything was frozen. The trees, the ground, the creek at the base of the ridge. And the morning light came through and everything just lit up. The whole forest. Ice and light. I stopped again. You've never seen anything like it, he said. I stood there for probably 20 minutes, I said. Just looking. There was no one to report to, no hierarchy to navigate, no one watching me for signs of incompatibility. Just me and the ice and the light. He was very still beside me. "That's what I want for you," he said. Quiet. Direct. The practiced indirection stripped completely away. Not just justice for what was done. I want you to have a life that has more days like that. My heart did something I wasn't going to acknowledge. "You don't owe me a life," I said carefully. "No," he said. "But I want to see you have one." A pause. "There's a difference." I looked at him. He looked back. The torchlight was doing things I wasn't going to let it do. Creating a warmth that I wasn't going to attribute to anything other than fire and cold night air and the proximity of another body. "The other thing," I said. Because I needed to redirect, and I needed information, and those two needs could serve each other. "In the library yesterday, you said that some of what you felt when you scented me was bloodline recognition, and some was something else." "Yes," he said. "You never finished that sentence." He was quiet. "I know," he said. "Are you going to?" A longer pause. He set down his mug on the bench beside him. He turned to face me more fully. "In the old law," he said carefully, "there's a bond that can exist between wolves of the sovereign line. Not always. Not guaranteed. But documented in the oldest records. A mate bond that the bloodline itself can produce when two compatible wolves of the line come into contact." My mouth was dry. "You're not saying?" "I'm not saying anything with certainty," he said. "Because I'm not certain. I know what I felt when you walked into my hall. I know what happens to my awareness every time you enter a room. I know," he stopped. Started again. "I know that when Greer walked in here and I understood what he'd done to you, the response I had was not political. It was not strategic." "What was it?" I said. "Primal," he said simply. "Protective in a way that has never happened to me before. And I've been a king since I was 19 years old. I've been responsible for the safety of thousands of wolves. But none of it has ever felt like." "Like what?" "Like this." He said it quietly, not dramatically. Like a fact he was reporting rather than a declaration he was making. Like something in me recognized something in you before I had any other information. I was looking at the mountain. Because if I looked at him, if I turned and looked at him properly in this torchlight with this honesty between us, something was going to happen that I wasn't ready for. "I've been a rogue for 3 days," I said. "I know. I don't know my actual bloodline yet. I don't know my family. I don't know what my legal status is or what any of this means for the court or the Pax or—" "I know," he said. "I don't know who I am yet." "I know," he said again. And then, "I'm not asking anything of you, Isla. I'm not. This is not an expectation. Or a pressure." He paused. "I'm just being honest with you because I think you've been lied to enough and I refuse to add to that." I turned and looked at him. His face was open in a way I hadn't seen it in the 2 days I'd known him. The king of it, the calculation. Not gone, but not present. Just him and the information and the honesty he was offering me with both hands. "I believe you," I said. "Which part?" "All of it," I said. "The recognition. The feeling. All of it." I held his gaze. "I felt it too. From the beginning. My wolf knew you before I did." He breathed out slowly. Not with relief, exactly. With something bigger than relief. "What do we do with that?" I said. "Nothing yet," he said. "We find out who you are. We deal with Dorian. We trace the northern compound and the eastern bloodline and the Ashbourne Council." He paused. "We build a foundation that's real before we build anything on it." "That's very reasonable," I said. "I'm occasionally reasonable," he said. I almost smiled. "Almost. For what it's worth," I said, looking back at the mountain, "I think you're what I would have built, if I'd been asked to build someone trustworthy from scratch." The silence that followed was warm. "That," he said quietly, "is the most significant thing anyone has ever said to me." The wind moved through the torches. The mountain held its silence. And we sat together in the courtyard of the sovereign court while the world was complicated and large and full of things we hadn't resolved yet, and it was somehow, one of the better moments of my life. Chapter 9. 3 days later, Bram's people reached the compound. We were in the war room when the message came in. Caden, Nessa, Bram, Petra, and me, now a regular presence at the strategy table in a way that had stopped requiring justification somewhere around day 2. Bram read the report. His face did something controlled and significant. "There's a woman," he said. The room went quiet. "At the compound," he said. "Elderly. Reclusive. She's been there for, our people are estimating, approximately 30 years. She uses a different name. She has staff who have been with her the entire time. She doesn't leave." Caden was very still. "Does she have the Valerian?" he said. "Our people couldn't get close enough to check directly. But," Bram turned the page. "One of them has a trained bloodline sensitivity. She says the signature coming off the compound is," he paused, "is strong. Strongly sovereign." "She's alive," I said. I didn't mean to say it out loud. But the words were already in the room. Seren Vale was alive. Caden's great-aunt, his father's sister, the woman who had been hidden 30 years ago and told to everyone as dead, was alive. Caden put his hands flat on the table. He didn't speak. Nessa looked at me. I looked at Caden. His face was working. Doing the thing it did when something enormous was being managed behind the control. His jaw was set, his breathing careful. The scar through his brow catching the light as he looked at the table and processed what we'd just heard. "Your Majesty," Petra said gently. "Give me a moment," he said. We gave him the moment. He straightened. "We go north," he said. "Your Majesty," Nessa began, "protocol requires." "We go north," he said. "The 3 of us." He looked at me and Bram. Small, fast. No ceremonial entourage. "We leave tomorrow at first light." "That's a 4-day ride," Bram said. 3 if we push, Caden said. 2 if we run, I said. Everyone looked at me. "She's been waiting 30 years, I said. "She deserves not to wait any longer than she has to." Caden held my gaze. 2 days, he said. The morning was still dark when we left. Running in wolf form across the sovereign territory and into the northern reaches, 3 wolves in the pre-dawn dark, moving fast and quiet through terrain that changed as we went. The dense forest of the Vale Mountains giving way to the high plateau of the mid-north, the ground harder, the trees sparser, the sky bigger. Caden ran ahead. Not by much, close enough for communication, far enough to give the impression of control. His wolf was enormous, which I had expected. Dark-coated, built like something the landscape had grown specifically to challenge. He moved like water over rock, adapting, continuous, effortless. My wolf kept pace without effort, which surprised me more than it seemed to surprise him. We stopped briefly at dawn to shift and eat something Bram had packed, and then ran again. The second day, we reached the northern edge of the high plateau and began descending into the valley. The compound appeared in the afternoon of the second day. It was not what I'd pictured. Not a fortress. Not a prison. A long, low building in pale stone set against the hillside with gardens. Actual gardens, even this late in the season, with the stubborn remnants of late-blooming things clinging to their structure despite the cold. Someone had been tending them for years. Someone who liked growing things. Someone who didn't know how long they'd have to stay but made a life anyway. We shifted at the tree line and approached on foot. The door opened before we knocked. The woman standing in the doorway was not frail. She was not broken. She was small and white-haired and held herself with the kind of dignity that doesn't require space to demonstrate itself. Her eyes went to Caden first. And I watched her face do something I had never seen a face do, something that required no interpretation, no reading, no careful passing of tells. Pure recognition. The kind that crosses 30 years like they're a river you ford in one step. "My brother's eyes," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands, held at her sides, were not. Caden, who had managed Dorian in the war room without a tremor. Who had run 2 days through wild terrain without complaint. Who had been 19 years old when a kingdom fell into his hands and had held it there ever since. Caden took 3 steps forward and put his arms around the small white-haired woman and pressed his face against her white hair. And didn't speak. She held him. Bram looked at the tree line. I looked at the garden. We gave them the moment. When they separated, Seren Vale, still sovereign in every line of her body despite 30 years of deliberate anonymity, looked past her great-nephew. And looked at me. Her eyes were dark. Familiar, somehow. Not like Caden's, but in the same family as Caden's, the same depth, the same quality of seeing more than was visible. "You're Lena's child," she said. My heart stopped. "Lena," I said. "Who is?" "My daughter," she said. "My firstborn." Her voice was very careful. She was removed from me when she was 7. I was told she went east. I was told, she stopped. I was told she would be safe. I looked at Caden. He was watching me with something in his face that he wasn't trying to hide anymore. "Lena," I said. "Short for Helena," Seren said. She was watching me with enormous effort at composure. She had the Valeran from birth. Strong. Visible even as an infant. That was why, she stopped again. That was why Dorian decided she was the greater risk. Why he removed her first. First. The son, I said. Dorian told Caden there was a son. Before Lena. Seren's expression shifted. "My son," she said. "Aldrich." Yes. He was removed before Lena, before I understood what was happening. I was told he died. She paused. I have spent 30 years not believing it. "Then there's more to find," I said. "Yes," she said. We stood in the compound doorway with the late afternoon light coming down through the valley and the garden holding on to its late blooms behind us, and everything expanded again. The family I was part of, the history that had been kept from all of us, the architecture of lies that Dorian had maintained for 3 decades. And beneath all of it, something else. Lena. My mother. A name I'd never had before. A face I still didn't have. A woman who had been taken from this woman when she was 7 years old and lost, maybe, somewhere in the chain of people who had spent 30 years trying to make sure the wrong people never found each other. She had green eyes, Seren said quietly, watching me. And she never stopped fighting. Even at 7. They had to carry her out. A pause. "You have her chin." My throat was doing something I wasn't going to acknowledge in front of these people. "I'm going to find her," I said. Seren looked at me. "I know," she said. She said it with certainty. The certainty of a woman who had survived 30 years of forced waiting and chosen, every single day, to still believe things were findable. "Come inside," she said. "Both of you. All 3 of you." She looked at Bram, still diplomatically studying the tree line. "There's enough for everyone." We went inside. Caden walked beside me through the low doorway. His hand, just briefly, just for a second, touched the back of mine. Not a hold. Just a touch. I didn't pull away. Chapter 10. We stayed 2 nights at the compound. Seren had things she needed to say that couldn't be rushed. 30 years of things. And Caden, the king who ran his court on efficiency and precision, let her take every minute she needed. I watched him transform slightly in her presence. Not weaken. Deepen. Like a root system becoming visible. Something that had always been there, underground, suddenly given air and light. They talked through the first night while Bram slept and I sat near the fire pretending to read one of the compound's books and actually listening to everything. Seren told him about his father. The real version. Not the official record, not the polished history the court maintained. The version that lived in a sister's memory. A young man who laughed too loud and was terrified of becoming his father and cried for 3 days when their first dog died and made every decision with the absolute conviction that he was doing the right thing even when he wasn't. Caden listened. He asked questions. Small ones. What did he eat for breakfast? Did he read before sleeping? Was he afraid when he took the throne or did he hide it well? The questions of a son who had lost a father too early and never stopped accumulating the small details that made a person real. I stopped pretending to read the book. At one point, somewhere in the 2nd hour, Seren looked across the fire and caught me watching. She didn't redirect me. Didn't suggest I give them privacy. She just included me in the look, in the warmth of it, like I had already been decided upon. Like my presence in this room was not a question she needed to evaluate. I felt something unlock quietly in my chest. I didn't name it. Not yet. In the morning, Seren took me to the garden. The air was cold enough to show our breath, and the garden was mostly structure at this point. The architecture of something that bloomed elsewhere in the year, now showing its bones. She walked through it with the ease of someone who knew exactly where each plant was regardless of what it currently looked like. Lena loved this, she said. She was small when we came here. She used to help me plant things. She paused beside a dormant rose structure. Old, the main cane as thick as my thumb. She planted this one herself. She was 4. I looked at the rose. My mother had planted this rose. 4 years old, hands in cold northern soil, putting something in the ground that was still here 20 years later. Still here. Tell me about her, I said. Seren told me. Not the narrative version. The remembered version, specific, sensory, gloriously incomplete the way real memory is. Lena at 4, determined, loud, convinced she could communicate with the birds in the trees behind the compound. Lena at 6, reading everything she could reach, asking questions that made Seren's tutors look at each other sideways. Lena at 7, the morning they came for her, standing in this very garden in the early light, and Seren remembering the specific quality of that morning. The frost on the dormant grass, the smell of wood smoke from the compound fire, the way Lena's small face had looked when the strangers arrived. She didn't cry, Seren said. That's what I remember most. She was 7 years old and she didn't cry. She looked at me with those green eyes and she said, Seren stopped. I waited. She said, I'll find you, Mama. The garden was very quiet. Did she? I said. My voice was steady. I was making it steady. Not yet, Seren said. But perhaps, she looked at me. Perhaps she sent you first. I looked at the dormant rose. Thick cane. Old wood. Something that had survived 30 northern winters because it was planted with care and tended with constancy and was, simply, too rooted to be moved. I'm going to find her, I said again. I know, Seren said again. And then she did something I didn't expect. She reached out and took my hand. Her grip was firm. Not tentative. Not the careful gesture of a woman approaching something fragile. The grip of someone who recognized family. I held on. We stood in the cold garden beside a rose my mother had planted and didn't speak for a while, and it was the most I had felt like I belonged somewhere in 22 years of trying to figure out where that was. On the second morning, we prepared to leave. Caden had sent messages back to the court from the compound. Bram's communication system, encrypted, efficient. The legal proceedings against Dorian were advancing. Petra had constructed a framework. The Ashbourne Council had been formally notified that their branding of a sovereign bloodline member was under review. But there was one conversation left. I found it happening in the main room when I came in from the garden. Seren and Caden at the table, both with tea, speaking quietly. I started to withdraw, but Seren lifted a hand. Sit, she said. This involves you. I sat. I've been telling Caden, Seren said, about Dorian. What about him? I said. He's not evil, she said. I held very still. He's afraid, she said. He has always been afraid. His whole life, afraid of being insufficient. Afraid of the bloodline hierarchy that placed him permanently second to his older brother. Afraid of what would happen when my brother died and the throne passed. She looked at her tea. He loved my brother. Genuinely. That's the tragedy of it. He loved him and he was afraid of what my existence represented, and later, what Lena and Aldrich's existence represented, and fear is a very effective corrosive. He had you imprisoned for 30 years, I said. Yes, she said. And I've thought about it every day for 30 years. I've been furious about it. I've mourned what it cost me. I've grieved my children's childhoods, all of it. She paused. And I've also come to understand that the punishment Dorian needs is not the punishment that will make me feel better. I looked at her. What does he need? I said. To face it, she said. To look at what he did clearly. To understand that the bloodline he spent 30 years trying to contain is sitting at his king's table, and the kingdom did not fall. And then, she paused again. And then perhaps, in time, to do something useful with whatever years he has left. You're more generous than I am, I said. I've had 30 years to practice, she said. Caden was watching me. What do you want, Isla? He said. The question was simple and it was enormous. What did I want? I wanted my mother found. I wanted Aldrich found. I wanted 30 years of deliberate erasure acknowledged and named. I wanted the Ashbourne brand removed, not just covered, not just legally voided but gone. I wanted the grey cloak burned. I wanted to stand in the sovereign court and not be a guest. Not be a managed situation. Not be a bloodline technicality. I wanted to be there. Fully, legitimately, by every right that 30 years of lies had denied me. I looked at Caden. I want what's mine, I said. Something shifted in his expression. Settled. Then we go back, he said, and we take it. Chapter 11. The Sovereign Court received us on the 4th day. We rode back in human form, slower, more visible, which was a choice. Caden's choice. A king returning from a significant journey with 2 companions, one of whom was wearing court-quality clothing and riding without a grey cloak. The court noticed. The gates opened. The courtyard filled. Not with ceremony. This wasn't that kind of return. With the organic gathering of a community that reads the air and understands that something has changed. Nessa met us at the inner gate. Her face when she looked at me was different from the first day. The first day she had looked at me with professional assessment. Now she looked at me with something that was closer to recognition. How did it go? She said. She's alive, Caden said. Seren Vale is alive and well and will be brought to the court within the fortnight once arrangements are made. Nessa absorbed this with remarkable composure. Dorian, she said. I'll see him this afternoon, Caden said. Has Petra finished the framework? Last night, Nessa said. She's been waiting. Good. He moved toward the entrance and then paused. He looked back at me. An hour. An hour, I confirmed. He went inside. And I stood in the courtyard of the Sovereign Court, which I had entered 4 days ago as a prisoner and was now returning to as something else entirely, and breathed the mountain air and let the enormity of it land somewhere it could be processed. My lady, a voice said. I turned. One of the court attendants, young, carefully neutral in expression. The king asked that the East Wing rooms be. I know, I said. Thank you. I went inside. The East Wing room had been upgraded while we were gone. Not dramatically. Caden wouldn't do dramatic. But the fire was already lit, the furniture was different, better, and on the table there was a small package with no label. Inside the package, a formal letter, sealed with the sovereign crest. I opened it. It was brief. Caden's handwriting. I recognized it from the documents in the war room. Direct, clean, no unnecessary ornamentation. Isla, the legal documentation confirming your bloodline status is with Petra. Your formal acknowledgement as a member of the sovereign line will be announced at the court assembly tomorrow. I wanted you to have the night to decide how you want to stand when that happens. Not what bloodline protocol requires. How you want to stand. See. I read it twice. I set it down. I looked at the fire. How did I want to stand? For 22 years I had learned to make myself useful and small and unnoticeable. To occupy exactly as much space as was allowed and no more. To file away my instincts and my intelligence and my anger into the parts of myself that didn't require anyone else's permission to exist. Tomorrow, in the Sovereign Court Assembly, my existence was going to be stated as a matter of public record. I would stand in front of every wolf in this court and every alpha who answered to the sovereign seat and the Ashbourne Council representatives who would be required to attend, and I would be named. Not a rogue. Not an incompatible anomaly. Not a grey cloak. I would be named as what I was. How did I want to stand? I thought about the border patrol officers in Ashbourne. The years of careful invisibility. The ice-lit forest on the winter morning 4 years ago. The 20 minutes alone with the light because there was no one to perform normalcy for. I thought about Seren in the cold garden, her grip firm on my hand. I thought about my mother at 7 years old, green-eyed and unafraid, telling her mother I'll find you. I stood up straighter in the empty room. There was my answer. The afternoon session with Dorian was closed. I wasn't in the gallery this time. This time I was in the room. Dorian entered and saw me, and something in his face went very quiet. Not afraid, not calculating, just quiet. The quiet of a man who has arrived at the thing he spent 30 years trying to avoid and finds that it is both worse and simpler than he imagined. We sat. Caden at the head, Petra to one side with her documents, Nessa near the door, Bram with his records. Me across from Dorian. He looked at me directly. You look like her, he said. Lena. She had he stopped. The same stillness. I've spent my whole life learning to be still, I said. It wasn't a choice. He flinched. Small. Controlled. But visible. I know, he said. Tell me why, I said. Not the political version. Not the version about stability and bloodline risk and sovereign succession. Tell me the actual reason. Dorian was quiet for a long moment. I was 28 when Seren had her first child, he said. Aldrich. The boy. He was extraordinary. From infancy, the bloodline signature was undeniable. And I stood in the room and held him, and I thought, he paused. I thought, this child will grow up and there will be a question. There will always be a question about who leads and who follows and what the sovereign line means when it has multiple branches. So you decided to answer the question yourself, I said. I decided to prevent it from being asked, he said. By erasing people, I said. By protecting the structure, he said. And then, before I could respond, I know that's not the same thing. I know that now. I knew it then, underneath everything. But when you're afraid, he stopped. Fear doesn't justify what you did, Caden said. No, Dorian said. It doesn't. Silence. Where is Aldrich? I said. I don't know, Dorian said. I genuinely don't know. He was placed with a pack in the Eastern Range. I don't know which one. I deliberately didn't track it. I told myself it was for security, but, he paused. I think I couldn't bear to know. And my mother, I said. Lena. She was placed in Ashbourne territory, he said. Not in the Ashbourne pack itself. In the independent settlements around its borders. I chose Ashbourne because it was controlled, stable, and, he stopped. Because you controlled Ashbourne, I said. Through Greer. Not directly, he said. But I had influence. I could monitor. I thought, he looked at the table. I thought if I could see her, if I could know she was safe. You didn't think about what she needed, I said. You thought about what you needed. He didn't answer. Because there was no answer. Petra laid the formal documents on the table. Dorian looked at them. They were thorough and they were serious. Suppression of sovereign bloodline. Falsification of lineage records. 30 years of deliberate confinement of a senior member of the sovereign line. The branding of a bloodline heir. The legal weight of it was enormous. What happens to me? Dorian said. Caden looked at him for a long moment. That depends, he said, on what you do next. What do you mean? You know things I don't, Caden said. The people who helped you. The networks used to monitor the hidden bloodline. The chain of contacts in Ashbourne and elsewhere. You know how to trace Aldrich's placement even if you don't know the destination. He paused. You can make this right, Dorian. Not undo it. But make right what can still be made right. Dorian looked at his nephew. Why would you trust me with that? He said. Because Seren asked me to, Caden said simply. Dorian's composure broke. Not dramatically. Quietly. The way old things break. Not with noise, but with the sound of something settling into what it actually is. He put his face in his hands for a moment. When he looked up, something in him was different. Not redeemed. Not forgiven. But, present. Actually present, maybe for the first time in 30 years, with the full weight of what he'd done carried without the architecture of justification around it. All right, he said. Tell me what you need. We worked until evening. And when it was done, when the documents were signed and the cooperation recorded and the first threads of the search for Aldrich and Lena formally established, Dorian Vale looked across the table at me one last time. "You should know," he said, "that Lena was remarkable. Even at 7. She was going to be," he stopped. "She was always going to be more than I could contain." "She still is," I said. "We just haven't found her yet." His mouth pressed together. "No," he agreed. "You haven't." I stood and I left the room. In the corridor, the evening light was coming in low and golden through the narrow windows, striping the stone floor in warm bars. The court was settling into its evening rhythms. The change of guard, the kitchen fires building, the low murmur of wolves who lived and worked in the same space finding their way toward rest. Caden caught up with me 20 steps from the door. He walked beside me without speaking for a moment. "How are you?" he said. "Complicated," I said. "That's a reasonable answer." "I keep waiting for it to feel like enough," I said. "The information. The framework. Dorian's cooperation. All of it. I keep waiting to feel like it's enough and It's not enough," he said. "Because it's not finished. Your mother hasn't been found. Aldrich hasn't been found. Saren hasn't been brought here yet. The Ashbourne brand is still on my back," I said. "Tomorrow," he said, "that changes." I looked at him sideways. "What does tomorrow change?" "Everything," he said quietly. "Officially and permanently." We walked together through the evening court and neither of us felt the need to fill the rest of the silence. Chapter 12. Morning came cold and bright. Mountain light, honest and undecorated. The kind of morning that doesn't soften anything, just illuminates it exactly as it is. I was dressed before the sun finished rising. Someone had left formal clothes at my door overnight. Not the elaborate ceremony wear I'd feared, but something that suited me better. Dark, well-fitted, the sovereign crest at the collar worked in silver thread. Significant without being costume. I put them on. I looked at myself in the mirror. The brand on my shoulder was still there beneath the fabric. It would need a healer to remove the scar tissue properly, and that would take time. But the mark of it, the legal designation, the social death sentence, that was about to be permanently dissolved. I looked at my own eyes. For 22 years those eyes had looked back at me from borrowed mirrors in borrowed spaces, trying to find some version of themselves that fit the role available. This morning they just looked like mine. Mira came to check the shoulder dressings and didn't say anything unnecessary, which was why I liked her. She finished, squeezed my arm once, and left. Nessa came next. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," I said. She walked with me to the great hall. The assembly was already gathered. Every ranked wolf in the court. Senior advisors. The 2 alpha representatives who served as Caden's inner council. The Ashbourne delegation, 4 wolves including Greer, who had not been permitted to leave and who stood now with the very particular expression of a man who has had 4 days of quiet reflection and arrived somewhere complicated. The great hall was bigger with people in it. Or maybe I was more aware of its size today. I walked in. Caden was at the far end, standing, not seated. Beside him, Petra with documents. Bram near the wall. Nessa moved to take her position behind me. I walked through the assembly. I walked slowly. Not because I was afraid. Because I was not going to rush this. Because 22 years of being told to make myself small and unnoticeable and unobtrusive were ending today, and I was going to walk through their ending with deliberate, unhurried steps. No one spoke. I reached the front. I stood. Caden looked at me. And I saw it again, what I'd seen in the great hall on the first morning. That expression that had no clean name. Recognition. Relief. Something that lived underneath the king of him in a place that had been empty for a long time and was not empty anymore. This assembly, Petra said, her voice carrying clearly, is convened to address a matter of sovereign bloodline status and to formally correct a record that has been kept false for 30 years. She laid out the facts. Not dramatically. Clearly. The way facts that are enormous are best delivered, without performance, without orchestration. Just the information, named and documented. Saren Vale. hidden 30 years ago, alive in the north. Her children removed from her, Aldrich, untraced. Lena, placed in the Ashbourne border territories under a concealed identity. Lena's daughter. Standing here. The individual known as Isla Voss, Petra said, carries the Valeran, the bloodline marker of the sovereign line, confirmed by 3 independent bloodline assessors in the past 72 hours. Her designation as a rogue is hereby formally dissolved under sovereign law, the Ashbourne brand rendered legally void, and her status recognized as a member of the founding bloodline of the sovereign seat. Silence. Furthermore, Petra said, the king has a formal address. She stepped back. Caden stepped forward. And every wolf in that room, dominant, powerful, accustomed to being significant, felt the shift in the air when the king of all alphas addressed his assembly not as a political formality but as something real. Isla Voss came into this court 4 days ago, he said. She came in chains. In a grey cloak. Branded by a pack acting on instructions from someone inside these walls. He paused. She came in half-starved and silver-burned and completely unwilling to look away. Something rippled through the assembly. What she didn't come in as, he said, was a rogue. She has never been a rogue. She has been a member of this bloodline every day of her life, denied the name of it, denied the history of it, denied the family of it. And the people in this room who carry rank and power and the privilege of a name they know, he let that sit for a moment. Need to understand what that costs. The great hall was completely silent. The sovereign line does not end with me, he said. It didn't end 30 years ago. It didn't end with a brand on a border. It is standing in this room and it is, as it has always been, exactly what it is. He looked at me. Isla. My name in that room. In that voice. In front of every wolf who had the power to define what a name meant. This court recognizes you, he said. Not as a guest. Not as a managed situation. As blood of this bloodline and a full member of the sovereign family. He paused. What you do with that, what role you want, what life you build from here, is yours to decide. But the recognition is not conditional on any of it. He stepped back slightly. And then, he did something that no one in that room had been prepared for. Something that would be discussed in every pack under the sovereign banner before the week was finished. Something that the old records would note as having no prior instance in documented history. King Caden Vale, the alpha of alphas, the 5th sovereign, the wolf who had unified 12 packs and held them there, lowered himself to one knee. In front of the assembly. In front of the Ashbourne delegation. In front of every ranked wolf who had ever been told that the sovereign only knelt to the land and the moon. He knelt. And looked up at me. Not with submission. Not with performance. With recognition. The kind that says, I see you. Not the role. Not the bloodline. You. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I looked down at him. And I thought about everything it had taken to get to this moment. The brand and the forest and the 3 days of running. The great hall and the library and the cold garden in the north. Seren's grip and the dormant rose and my mother's name said out loud for the first time in my life. I thought about the ice-lit forest on the winter morning 4 years ago. And I reached down and put my hand on Caden's shoulder and said, Stand up. He looked at me. Stand up, I said again. Quietly. Just for him. We do this together or not at all. Something in his face. I would try to describe it for years and never quite find the words. What happens to a person's face when they have been carrying something alone for a very long time and someone puts their hand next to theirs on the weight of it? He stood. He stood and he was beside me and we faced the assembly together. And the great hall of the sovereign court, 4 centuries of stone and history and power, held us both in it. Greer, in the Ashbourne delegation, looked at me across the space. His face was complicated. Guilt and something older than guilt, the particular expression of a man watching the consequence of his choices become undeniable. He gave me, very slightly, a nod. I received it. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever, completely. But received. The assembly broke into sound after that. Not chaos, not argument. the controlled, formal murmur of many powerful people absorbing a significant development and beginning to process its implications. Nessa appeared at my shoulder. "The Ashbourne brand," she said quietly. "Mira can begin the removal process tomorrow if you're ready." "I'm ready," I said. "And the grey cloak," she said. It's already been burned," I said. She almost smiled. "Yes." "Good," I said. Caden was beside me still. Close enough that I was aware of the warmth of him, that specific temperature that my wolf had been cataloguing since the Great Hall on the first morning and filing under significant in a place I'd been pretending not to have. "How do you feel?" he said. "Like myself," I said. He looked at me. "For the first time," I said, "I feel exactly like myself." The morning light came through the high windows and fell across the stone floor in the same bars it had been falling in for 4 centuries, illuminating everything exactly as it was. The N.